The sound you hear is sunset on Christmas Day in a country cottage. This is the start of Octoberpod. The Gardener, an Octoberpod Ghost Story for Christmas. Written by EF Benson, narrated by Edward October. Two friends of mine, Hugh Granger and his wife Margaret, had taken for a month of Christmas holiday the house in which we were to witness such strange manifestations. And when I received an invitation from them to spend a fortnight there, I enthusiastically accepted. Well did I know that pleasant heathery countryside, and most intimate was my acquaintance with the subtle hazards of its charming golf links. Golf, I was given to understand, was to occupy the solid day for Hugh and me, so that Margaret should never be obliged to set her hand to the implements with which the game, so detestable to her, was conducted. I arrived there while yet the daylight lingered, and as my hosts were out, I took a ramble round the place. The house and garden stood on a plateau facing south. Below it were a couple of acres of pasture that sloped down to a vagrant stream crossed by a footbridge, by the side of which stood a thatched cottage with a vegetable patch surrounding it. A path ran close past this, across the pasture, from a wicket gate in the garden, conducted you over the footbridge, and so constituted a shortcut to the links that lay not half a mile beyond. The cottage itself was clearly on the land of the little estate, and I supposed it to be the gardener's house. And yet it appeared to be untenanted. No wreath of smoke, though the evening was chilly, curled from its chimneys, and, coming closer, I fancied it had that air of waiting about it. There it stood with no sign of life whatever about it, though ready, as its apparently perfect state of repair seemed to warrant, for fresh tenants to put the breath of life into it again. Its little garden, too, told the same tale. The beds were untended and unweeded, and the flower border by the front door was a row of chrysanthemums, which had withered on their stems. But all this was the impression of a moment, and I did not pause as I passed it, but crossed the footbridge and went up the heathery slope that lay beyond. I made a detour, as a golfer will, to walk up the fairway of the 17th and 18th holes, just for the pleasure of recognition, and looked respectfully at the yawning sandpit which so inexorably guards the 18th green. The light of the winter evening had faded fast, and when I crossed the footbridge on my return, the dusk had gathered. To my right, just beside the path, lay the cottage, the whitewashed walls of which gleamed in the gloaming. And as I turned my glance back from it to the rather narrow plank which bridged the stream, I thought I caught, out of the tail of my eye, some light from one of its windows, which thus disproved my theory that it was untenanted. But when I looked directly at it again, I saw that I was mistaken. Some reflection in the glass of the red lines of sunset in the west must have deceived me, for in the inclement twilight it looked more desolate than ever. Yet I lingered by the wicket gate in its low palings, for though all exterior evidence bore witness to its emptiness, some inexplicable feeling assured me, quite irrationally, that this was not so, and that there was somebody there. Certainly there was nobody visible, but it became a matter of importance in my mind to ascertain whether this was so. I went through the small garden and rapped at the door. There was no answer, and after waiting for a response to a second summons, and having tried the door and found it locked, I made the circuit of the house. Of course there was no one there, and I told myself that I was just like a man who looks under his bed for a burglar, and would be beyond measure astonished if he found one. My hosts were at the house when I arrived, and we spent a cheerful 2 hours before dinner in such eager conversation as is proper between friends who have not met for some time. Between Hugh Granger and his wife, it is always impossible to light upon a subject which does not vividly interest one or other of them, and so golf, politics, cooking, ghosts, and the income tax were among the topics which we passionately discussed. With all these plates spinning, it was easy to whip up any one of them, and the subject of spooks generally was lighted upon again and again. "Margaret is on the high road to madness," remarked Hugh on one of these occasions. You see, she's begun using planchette. I'm told that if you use planchette for 6 months, most careful doctors will conscientiously certify you as insane. By my calculations, she's got 5 months more before she goes to bedlam. Oh, it says most interesting things, said Margaret. It says things that never entered my head. We'll try it tonight. Not tonight, said Hugh. Let's have an evening off. Margaret disregarded this. And it's no use asking planchette questions, she went on, because there's in your mind some sort of answer to them. If I ask whether it will be fair tomorrow, for instance, it is probably I, though indeed I don't mean to push, who makes the pencil say yes. And then it usually rains, remarked Hugh. Not always. Don't interrupt. The interesting thing is to let the pencil write what it chooses. And very often, it only makes loops and curves, though they may mean something. And every now and then a word comes, the significance of which I have no idea whatever, so I clearly couldn't have suggested it. Yesterday evening, for instance, it wrote gardener over and over again. Now what did that mean? The gardener here is a Methodist with a chin beard. Could it have meant him? Oh, it's time to dress. Do be punctual. My cook is so sensitive about soup. By the way, I asked, what's that cottage in the field by the footbridge? Is that the gardener's cottage? It used to be, said Hugh, but the chinbeard doesn't live there. In fact, nobody lives there. It's empty. If I owned this estate, I should put the chinbeard into it and take the rent off his wages. Some people have no idea of economy. Why do you ask? I saw Margaret was looking at me rather attentively. Curiosity. Idle curiosity.
As I wander out under the sky, how Jesus, our Savior, did come forth to die. For poor ornery people like you and like I wonder, as I wonder.
A gleam of strong moonlight between my drawn curtains when I went up to bed that night led me to look out. My room faced the garden and the fields which I had traversed that afternoon, and all was vividly illuminated by the full moon. The thatched cottage with its white walls close by the stream was very distinct, and once more, I suppose, the reflection of the light on the glass of one of its windows made it appear that the room was lit from within. It struck me as odd that twice that day this illusion should have been presented to me, but now a yet odder thing happened. Even as I looked, the light was extinguished. The morning did not at all bear out the fine promise of the clear night, for when I woke the wind was squealing, and sheets of rain from the southwest were dashed against my panes. Golf was wholly out of the question, and though the violence of the storm abated in the afternoon, the rain dripped with a steady sullenness. But I wearied of indoors, and since the others entirely refused to set foot outside, I went forth mackintoshed to get a breath of air. I took the road to the links in preference to the muddy shortcut through the fields, with the intention of engaging a couple of caddies for Hugh and myself next morning, and then lingered a while over illustrated papers in the smoking room. I must have read for longer than I knew, for a sudden beam of the sunset suddenly illuminated my page, and, looking up, I saw that the rain had ceased and that evening was fast coming on. So, instead of taking the long detour by the road again, I set forth homewards by the path across the fields. That gleam of sunset was the last of the day, and once again, just as 24 hours ago, I crossed the footbridge in the gloaming. Till that moment, I had not thought at all about the cottage there, but now in a flash, the light I had seen there last night, suddenly extinguished, recalled itself to my mind, and at the same moment, I felt that invincible conviction that the cottage was indeed tenanted. Simultaneously, in these swift processes of thought, I looked towards it, and saw standing by the door the figure of a man. In the dusk, I could distinguish nothing of his face, if indeed it was turned to me, and only got the impression of a tallish fellow, thickly built. He opened the door, from which came a dim light, as of a lamp, entered, and shut it after him. So then my conviction was right. Yet I had been distinctly told that the cottage was empty. Who then was he that entered as if returning home? Once more, this time with a certain qualm of fear, I rapped on the door, intending to put some trivial question, and rapped again, this time more drastically, so that there could be no question that my summons was unheard. But still I got no reply. And finally I tried the handle of the door. It was locked. Then, with difficulty mastering an increasing terror, I made the circuit of the cottage, peering into each unshuttered window. All was dark within, though but 2 minutes ago I had seen the gleam of light escape from the opened door. I made no allusion to my hosts of this odd adventure, and after dinner Margaret, amid protests from Hugh, got out the planchette which had persisted in writing Gardener. My surmise was, of course, utterly fantastic, but I wanted to convey no suggestion of any sort to Margaret. For a long time the pencil skated over her paper, making loops and curves and peaks like a temperature chart, and she had begun to yawn and grow weary over her experiment before any coherent word emerged. And then, in the oddest way, her head nodded forward and she seemed to have fallen asleep. She fell asleep the other night over it, Hugh said to me in a whisper. Margaret's eyes were closed, and she breathed the long, quiet breaths of slumber, and then her hand began to move with a curious firmness. Right across the big sheet of paper went a level line of writing, and at the end, her hand stopped with a jerk, and she woke. She looked at the paper and read what she had written. Gardener, gardener, it ran. I am the gardener. I want to come in. I can't find her here. Looking up from the paper, I saw Margaret's eyes fixed on me, and even before she spoke, I knew what her thought was. Did you come by the empty cottage? She asked. Yes, I said. Still empty? She said in a low voice. Or anything else? I did not want to tell her just what I had seen, or what, at any rate, I thought I had seen. I rapped at the door again, I said, and there was no answer. Presently there was a move to bed, and after she had gone upstairs, Hugh and I went to the front door to interrogate the weather. Once more the moon shone in a clear sky, and we strolled out along the flagged path that fronted the house. Suddenly, Hugh turned quickly and pointed to the angle of the house. Who on earth is that? He said. Look, there. He's gone round the corner. I had but the glimpse of a tallish man with heavy build. Didn't you see him? Asked Hugh. I'll just go round the house and find him. I don't want anyone prowling round us at night. Wait here, will you? And if he comes round the other corner, ask him what his business is. Hugh had left me in our stroll, close by the front door, which was open, and there I waited until he should have made his circuit. He had hardly disappeared when I heard, quite distinctly, a rather quick but heavy footfall coming along the paved walk towards me from the opposite direction. But there was absolutely no one to be seen who made this sound of rapid walking. Closer and closer to me came the steps of the invisible one, and then, with a shudder of horror, I felt someone unseen push by me as I stood on the threshold. That shudder was not merely of the spirit, for the touch of him was that of ice on my hand. I tried to seize this impalpable intruder, but he slipped from me, and next moment I heard his steps on the parquet of the floor inside. Some door within opened and shut, and I heard no more of him. Next moment Hugh came running round the corner of the house, from which the sound of steps had approached. Well, where is he? He asked. He was not 20 yards in front of me. A big, tall fellow. I saw no one. I said. I heard his step along the walk, but there was nothing to be seen. Whatever it was seemed to brush by me and go into the house. There had certainly been no sound of steps on the bare oak stairs, and we searched room after room through the ground floor of the house. The dining room door was locked, and the only other door which could have furnished the impression of an opening and a shutting was that into the kitchen. Here again our quest was fruitless. Through pantry and scullery and boot room, but all was empty and quiet. Finally we came to the kitchen, which too was empty, but by the hearth there was set a rocking chair, and this was oscillating to and fro as if someone, lately sitting there, had just quitted it. There it stood gently rocking, and this seemed to convey the sense of a presence, invisible now, more than even the sight of him who surely had been sitting there could have done. I remember wanting to steady it and stop it, and yet my hand refused to go forth to it. I had a broken night after that. Long I lay wide-eyed and open-eared, and when at last I dozed, I was plucked from the borderland of sleep by the sound, muffled but unmistakable, of someone moving about the house. It occurred to me that the steps might be those of Hugh conducting a lonely exploration, but even while I wondered, a tap came at the door of communication between our rooms, and in answer to my response it appeared that Hugh had come to see whether it was I thus uneasily wandering. Even as we spoke, the step passed my door, and the stairs leading to the floor above creaked to its ascent. Next moment it sounded directly above our heads, in some attics in the roof. "Those are not the servants' bedrooms," said Hugh. "No one sleeps there. Let's look once more. It must be somebody." With lit candles we made our way upstairs, and just when we were at the top of the flight, Hugh uttered a sharp exclamation. "Something's passing by me," he said, and he clutched at the empty air. Even as he spoke, I experienced the same sensation, and the moment afterwards the stairs below us creaked again as the unseen passed down. All night long that sound of steps moved about the passages, as if someone was searching the house, and as I lay awake and listened, that message, which had come through the pencil of the planchette to Margaret's fingers, occurred to me. I want to come in. I cannot find her here. The next morning, as I dressed, I found myself vainly trying to recapture the horror of the spirit which had accompanied these nocturnal adventures. I remembered that something within me had sickened as I watched the movements of the rocking chair the night before, and as I heard the steps along the paved way outside, and by that invisible pressure against me, knew that someone had entered the house. But now in the sane and tranquil morning, and all day under the serene winter sun, I could not realize what it had been. The presence, like the bodily pain, had to be there for the realization of it, and all day it was absent. "Well, he's had a good look," Hugh said, "whoever he is, and whomever he was looking for. By the way, not a word to Margaret, please. She heard nothing of these perambulations, nor of the entry of whatever it was." Margaret had arranged to drive over to have tea with some friends of hers that afternoon, and in consequence Hugh and I refreshed ourselves at the clubhouse after our game. And it was already dusk when, for the third day in succession, I passed homewards by the whitewashed cottage. But tonight I had no sense of it being subtly occupied. It stood mournfully desolate, as is the way of untenanted houses, and no light nor semblance of such gleamed from its windows. "A psychic disturbance, old boy," Hugh said as we reached the door to the main house. "Like a cold, but in the head. Hello? The door is locked." He rang and rapped, and from inside the noise of a turned key and withdrawn bolts. "What's this door locked for?" he asked the servant who opened it. The man shifted from one foot to the other. "The bell rang half an hour ago, sir," he said, "and when I came to answer it, there was a man standing outside and—" "Well?" asked Hugh. "I didn't like the look of him, sir," he said, "and I asked him his business. He didn't say anything, and then he must have gone pretty smartly away, for I never saw him go." "Where did he seem to go?" asked Hugh, glancing at me. "I can't rightly say, sir. He didn't seem to go at all. Something seemed to brush right by me." "That'll do," said Hugh, rather sharply. Presently, Margaret returned from her visit with a flush of excitement on her face. "Never laugh at my planchette again," she said. "I've heard the most extraordinary story from Maud Ashfield. Horrible, but so frightfully interesting. There was once a gardener who used to live in that little cottage by the footbridge, and when the family were up in London, he and his wife used to be caretakers, and lived here." Hugh's glance and mine met. Then he turned away, and I knew that his thoughts were identical with my own. "He married a wife much younger than himself," continued Margaret, "and gradually he became frightfully jealous of her. And one day, in a fit of passion, he strangled her with his own hands. A little while after, someone came to the cottage and found him sobbing over her, trying to restore her. They went for the police, but before they came, he had cut his own throat. Isn't it positively horrible? It is rather curious that the planchette said gardener. I am the gardener. I want to come in. I can't find her here. You see, I knew nothing about it. Nothing at all. I shall do planchette again tonight. Oh, dear me. The post goes in half an hour, and I have a whole budget to send. And you respect my planchette for the future, Hughie." We talked the situation out when she had gone, but Hugh, unwillingly convinced and yet unwilling to admit that the planchette nonsense may not be nonsense, still insisted that Margaret should be told nothing of what we had heard and seen in the house that night. "She'll be frightened," he said, "and she'll begin imagining things. As for the planchette, as likely as not it will do nothing but scribble and make loops." "What's that?" There had come from somewhere in the room one sharp, peremptory rap. I did not think it came from the door, but Hugh, when no response replied to his words of admittance, jumped up and opened it. He took a few steps into the hall outside and returned. "No one there," he said. "Not a soul." Hugh came back to the fireplace and rather irritably threw a cigarette which he had just lit into the fender. "We've got to keep a hand on ourselves," he said. "There is nothing so infectious as fear, and Margaret mustn't catch it from us. But there's something more than our fear. Something has got into the house, and we're up against it." "If you want to know what I think it is," said I believe it to be the spirit of the man who strangled his wife and then cut his throat. But I don't see how it can hurt us. We're afraid of our own fear, really. But we're up against it," said Hugh. "And what will it do? Good Lord, if I only knew what it would do, I shouldn't mind. It's the not knowing." Well, it's time to dress. Margaret was in her highest spirits at dinner, knowing nothing of the manifestations of that presence which had taken place in the last 24 hours. She thought it absorbingly interesting that her planchette should have guessed about the gardener, and from that topic she flitted to the topic of a form of rummy for 3, which her friend had showed her, promising to initiate us into it after dinner. This she did, and, not knowing that we, above all things, wanted to keep planchette at a distance, she was delighted with the success of her game. But suddenly she observed that the evening was rapidly burning away, and swept the cards together at the conclusion of a hand. "Now, just half an hour of planchette," she said. Margaret had already got out her machine and a sheet of paper when Hugh rose. "Please, don't do it tonight, Margaret," he said. "Hughie, you've got something on your mind," she said. "Out with it." I could see Hugh debating in his mind as to whether to tell her or not, and I gathered that he chose the chance of her planchette inanely scribbling. "Go on, then," he said. Margaret hesitated. She clearly did not want to vex Hugh. "Well, just 10 minutes," she said, "and I promise not to think of gardeners." She had hardly laid her hand on the board when her head fell forward, and the machine began moving. I was sitting close to her, and as it rolled steadily along the paper, the writing became visible. "I have come in," it ran. "But still I cannot find her. Are you hiding her? I will search the room where you are." At that moment, a current of icy air swept round the room, and at the door, this time unmistakably, came a loud, peremptory knock. Hugh sprang to his feet. "Margaret, wake up," he said. "Something is coming." The door opened, and there moved in the figure of a man. He stood just within the door, his head bent forward, and he turned it from side to side, peering, it would seem, with eyes staring and infinitely sad into every corner of the room. The ghost was now looking directly at Margaret. Once the lips above the thick, rust-colored beard moved, but no sound came forth. The mouth only moved and slavered. He raised his head, and I saw that one side of his neck was laid open in a red, glistening gash. For how long that pause continued when we all three stood stiff and frozen in some deadly inhibition to move or speak, I have no idea. I suppose that at the utmost it was a dozen seconds. Then the spectre turned and went out as it had come. We heard his steps pass along the parquet floor. There was the sound of bolts withdrawn from the front door, and with a crash that shook the house, it slammed to. The remainder of our Christmas holiday passed without incident, and though Margaret posited many wild suppositions about the ghostly presence, we spoke little more of the visitation. The weather took a beastly turn, and our subsequent sessions on the links were fleeting. The next year, I Christmased in San Moritz with my friend Roderick. The slopes were treacherous. Our lodgings were cramped and drafty. The hotel dining room was plagued by the worst species of tourist. The food was bad, and the waiters were rude. I wouldn't have had it any other way. You have been listening to The Gardener by EF Benson, an Octoberpod Ghost Story for Christmas, narrated by Edward October. Hear that jingle jingle? It could be Kris Kringle, or a home invader coming down the chimney, a jilted lover flashing a knife under the mistletoe, or a disgruntled co-worker at the office Christmas party, lacing the punch with arsenic.
It's disgusting.
Jen and Cam, the hosts of our true crime podcast, are always on Santa's nice list. But this holiday season, they're filling your stockings with 12 nightmarish crimes committed by the lowest scumbags on the naughty list.
It happened in Florida, so everybody's now going, yeah.
They'll be coming down the chimney, counting down the 12 nights till Christmas.
Did I say it
1,
6?
2, 3, 4, 5,
Yeah,
7, 8,
that's
9.
it.
With a different true crime case every night, each one naughtier than the last.
This one is a doozy.
So spike your eggnog,
It's going to make you want to regurgitate.
because you'll need it for our true crime podcast's 12 Nightmares Before Christmas. They're coming to town December 13th through 24th. Listen to our true crime podcast on your favorite podcast apps.
Well, I cannot wait. Hit me with it. Let's hear it. Let's hear it. Dive right in.
On social media is helping solve major crimes and exposing others.
2 local police departments are using the power of social media to catch the bad guys on a regular basis.
Hey guys, it's Marianne, dog mom, baker, true crime podcast maker. When my friend Krista Martin was murdered back on October 1st, 1989, there was barely a blurb out there on media on her case. And unfortunately, that is still the way it is to this day. It just seems to be the status quo on a lot of cases. And I refuse to allow that to happen. So that's our mission, to change that, to be the voice for those that go unheard, to be the voice and give those a social media presence. Because more than 200,000 unsolved cases have gone cold since 1980. By using social media, podcast platforms, case flyers, and hashtags, law enforcement and family are able to track the chatter and comments on certain cases. And you can join this movement by listening to our podcast, The Social Detective, on any of your streaming platforms. You can also join us on Instagram, Twitter, or I guess it's called X now, Threads, Facebook, you name it, you can find us. Join the Social Detective and the Crime Solve movement. Help us assist law enforcement by putting a few in the win column. And I really hope Krista's case is one of them.
If you like weird, spooky, and strange history, then I have the podcast for you. My name is Brenda, and I'm the host of Horrifying History. Are you into the dark side of history? Horrifying History tells you about the side of history that people don't normally talk about. We tell the tales of haunted places, infamous true crimes, the paranormal, and unsolved mysteries, and then we look to history to see where the truth actually lies. Want to get spooky with us? Get your Horrifying History fix by subscribing today on Spotify, Spreaker, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts.
I'm Edward October. For more true, true-ish, and classic tales of horror and the paranormal, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Be sure to ring the bell so you don't miss anything. Or find all of our links at octoberpodvhs.com. Octoberpod, retro horror for bold individualists.